The Bitter Brew of Bloomsbury, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins in the quiet literary streets of Bloomsbury, where scholars, writers, and respectable society figures gather over cups of tea and thoughtful conversation. It is a place known for intellect and refinement, the last place anyone would expect something sinister to unfold. But when a simple cup of tea leaves someone suddenly and mysteriously ill, whispers begin to circulate through the elegant drawing rooms and book-lined studies. What first appears to be an unfortunate accident soon begins to taste far more bitter. Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human nature, quickly senses that the polite smiles and cultured manners of Bloomsbury may be hiding something darker. Behind the clinking teacups and carefully chosen words lies a secret someone was willing to poison to protect. Because sometimes the most civilized places can conceal the most dangerous intentions. Before we uncover the truth behind the bitter brew of Bloomsbury, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Bitter Brew of Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury woke slowly that morning, wrapped in a quiet gray light that drifted through the narrow streets like a hesitant visitor. The city had not yet reached the restless pace of midday. Shop doors opened one by one, newspapers were stacked neatly outside small stalls, and the smell of roasted coffee slipped into the cool air from a modest café resting between a bookshop and a tailor's store. The café was known as the Copper Kettle, and for many people in the neighborhood it was the calm beginning of their day. Inside the café, warmth replaced the chill of the street. Wooden tables carried the soft marks of years of use, and shelves behind the counter held jars of dark coffee beans and carefully folded packets of tea. A brass clock ticked gently on the wall, its steady rhythm blending with the quiet conversation of the morning guests. Steam rose from cups placed across the room, carrying the comforting scent of coffee through the air. At a small table near the window sat Miss Jane Marple. She appeared, at first glance, to be doing nothing remarkable at all. Her gloved hands rested neatly around a delicate teacup, and her expression held the peaceful patience of someone enjoying a simple morning. Yet Miss Marple had a remarkable habit of noticing things other people overlooked. While her eyes seemed calm, they quietly observed every corner of the room. She noticed the way the young assistant behind the counter wiped the same surface again and again, though it was already perfectly clean. She noticed the anxious way the cafe owner kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone who had not yet arrived. And she noticed a faint tension in the air that did not belong in such a peaceful place. The owner of the Copper Kettle was Arthur Bellamy, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache and a reputation for cheerful conversation. Normally, his laughter could be heard from the street, loud and welcoming, but this morning he spoke less than usual, and when he did speak, the sound carried a tightness that did not match his friendly smile. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, watching the small swirl in the cup. It was not the first time she had sensed something unusual in an otherwise ordinary setting. In fact, many troubling matters in her life had begun in places that seemed perfectly harmless. A village garden party, a quiet afternoon walk, a polite dinner invitation. Trouble, she had learned, often preferred to hide behind the appearance of calm. Two men sat at the table beside the wall, speaking in low voices as they examined their coffee.
One of them lifted his cup cautiously and took a sip. His eyebrows pulled together almost immediately. "That tastes odd," he muttered. The man across from him frowned and tried his own drink. After a moment, he set the cup down slowly. "You are right. That is far more bitter than usual." The young assistant behind the counter, Thomas Reed, heard them and approached quickly. He carried a tray in one hand, though Miss Marple noticed that his fingers trembled slightly. "Is something wrong, gentlemen?" he asked politely. The first man pushed his cup away from him. "I have been coming here for years, and I have never tasted coffee like this before." Thomas looked puzzled. "The beans were roasted just yesterday evening. Mr. Bellamy prepared them himself." The second man shrugged. "Well, something is certainly different today." Arthur Bellamy heard the conversation and stepped forward with a forced smile. "Ah, perhaps the roast was a little strong this morning," he said quickly. "I will bring you a fresh cup." He collected the pot from the counter and poured the remaining coffee into the sink. The movement was quick, almost hurried, as though he wished to be rid of the liquid as soon as possible. Miss Marple noticed that he did not taste it himself. That detail stayed quietly in her mind. The cafe door opened a few minutes later with a soft chime from the bell above it. A tall gentleman stepped inside, removing his hat as he entered. He carried himself with confident elegance, leaning lightly on a polished walking cane. Miss Marple recognized him immediately. It was Dr. Leonard Grayson, a well-known professor from the nearby university. He was a man admired for his intelligence, though not everyone enjoyed his sharp opinions. Still, he was a regular visitor at the Copper Kettle and followed the same routine every morning. He arrived at 9 o'clock, he greeted Arthur Bellamy loudly, and he ordered the strongest coffee in the house. "Bellamy," he said with cheerful authority, "my usual coffee this morning, strong enough to wake the entire university." Arthur Bellamy hesitated. The pause was brief, so brief that most people would not have noticed, but Miss Marple noticed many things others missed. Then the cafe owner nodded. "Of course, doctor," he replied. Thomas Reed prepared the coffee quickly. The dark liquid steamed gently as he carried the cup across the room and placed it before the professor. The professor smiled with satisfaction. "Perfect. Nothing begins a day better than good coffee." Miss Marple watched carefully as he lifted the cup. He took a long drink. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The professor placed the cup back on the table and adjusted his coat as if preparing to continue speaking. Then he coughed. At first, it sounded harmless, the kind of cough that follows a drink taken too quickly. But the cough did not stop. His face tightened, and his hand gripped the edge of the table. Thomas Reed stepped forward nervously. "Doctor, are you all right?" The professor tried to answer, but the words did not come easily. His breathing grew harsh and uneven. The chair scraped loudly across the floor as he attempted to stand. Then the chair tipped over. The crash echoed through the cafe. Several customers gasped as the professor collapsed heavily on the wooden floor. His cane rolled across the room, striking the leg of another table before coming to rest. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire cafe had fallen silent. Arthur Bellamy rushed forward, his face pale. "Dr. Grayson," he said urgently, kneeling beside him. "Can you hear me?" But the professor did not respond. His eyes stared upward, unfocused, and his breathing had already begun to fade. Someone whispered that a doctor should be called, though it seemed painfully clear that help might already be too late. Miss Marple remained seated. She did not rush toward the fallen man like the others. Instead, she watched the room carefully, observing the expressions on every face. Thomas Reed looked terrified. One of the customers had covered his mouth in shock. Another man stared at the spilled coffee on the floor as if it might explain everything. But Arthur Bellamy looked different. His face was certainly pale, yet beneath the fear, Miss Marple saw something else, something deeper. It was not surprise, it was recognition. Within minutes, a doctor from a nearby clinic arrived, summoned by a hurried messenger from the street. He examined the professor quietly, while the customers waited in tense silence. At last, the doctor stood. "I am afraid," he said slowly, "that Dr. Grayson is dead." The words seemed to settle heavily over the room. Thomas Reed leaned against the counter, as though his legs had lost their strength. Arthur Bellamy lowered his head, but Miss Marple's gaze moved toward the coffee cup still resting on the table. A thin trail of steam continued to rise from it. She looked at the dark liquid for a long moment, thoughtful and calm. Then she murmured softly to herself. "That," she said quietly, "that was no ordinary cup of coffee." And in that peaceful café, where mornings had always begun with comfort and conversation, Miss Marple realized that something far more dangerous than bitter coffee had just been served. The mystery of the Copper Kettle had begun.
Chapter 2. The Poison Beneath the Bitter Brew. The quiet comfort of the Copper Kettle had vanished completely. Only minutes earlier, the café had been filled with the soft sounds of conversation and clinking cups, but now the room held a heavy stillness that pressed against every wall. Dr. Leonard Grayson's body had been carefully moved to a nearby chair while the doctor waited for the authorities to arrive. No one seemed willing to speak loudly, as though raising their voice might somehow make the terrible event more real. Miss Marple remained seated at her small table near the window. Her teacup had long since cooled, yet she had not moved it. Instead, she watched the room with quiet patience. Panic often clouded the thoughts of others, but Miss Marple had learned that calm observation revealed far more than hurried action. Arthur Bellamy stood behind the counter, gripping the edge so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. His earlier cheerfulness had disappeared completely. Every few moments he wiped the same spot on the wooden surface with a cloth, though there was nothing there to clean. The motion was restless and repetitive, the behavior of a man trying desperately to steady his nerves. Thomas Reed moved slowly between the tables, collecting cups that no one had finished. The young assistant looked shaken, his hands still trembling as he worked. More than once he glanced toward the chair where the professor sat motionless. Each time he quickly looked away again. A murmur spread through the remaining customers as the café door opened once more. 2 police officers entered, followed by a serious-looking inspector whose calm expression suggested a man accustomed to difficult situations. The inspector removed his hat and looked around the room carefully before speaking. "My name is Inspector Harold Finch," he said in a steady voice. "I understand a gentleman has died here." The doctor stepped forward and explained the situation quietly. The inspector listened without interrupting, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the coffee cup that still sat on the professor's table. "Did he complain of illness before drinking the coffee?" the doctor asked. "No," the doctor replied. "His collapse came almost immediately after he drank it." Inspector Finch nodded slowly. His gaze shifted toward Arthur Bellamy. "You are the owner of this establishment, I presume?" Bellamy cleared his throat. "Yes, Arthur Bellamy. I have owned this café for nearly 20 years. Then perhaps you can explain what was served to the professor this morning." Bellamy hesitated briefly before answering. "Only coffee, Inspector. The same coffee we serve every day." Inspector Finch stepped toward the table where the cup remained. He bent down slightly, examining the dark liquid with careful attention.
The smell rising from the cup carried the sharp bitterness already mentioned by several customers. "Did anyone else drink from this pot?" Two men at the far table raised their hands uncertainly. "We did," one of them said, "but we noticed the taste was unpleasant, stronger than usual." Inspector Finch turned toward the young assistant. "You prepared the coffee?" Thomas Reed nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. Mr. Bellamy roasted the beans yesterday evening. I only brewed them this morning." Miss Marple watched the conversation with quiet interest. Each answer was simple enough on the surface, yet something about the sequence of events felt strangely incomplete. Inspector Finch asked a few more questions before finally addressing the room. "For the moment," he said calmly, "I would ask everyone to remain here. Until we understand what has happened, no one should leave the café." The statement produced a ripple of unease among the customers, though no one argued. Miss Marple slowly rose from her chair and approached the inspector with polite composure. "Excuse me, Inspector," she said gently. "I hope you will forgive the interruption, but I happened to observe the events rather closely." The inspector studied her for a moment. There was something about her calm manner that suggested quiet intelligence. "And you are?" "Jane Marple." The inspector nodded. "Very well, Miss Marple. What did you observe?" She spoke in a thoughtful tone, choosing her words carefully. "I noticed that several customers found the coffee unusually bitter this morning. I also noticed that Mr. Bellamy disposed of the remaining pot rather quickly once those complaints were made." Arthur Bellamy stiffened slightly behind the counter. "I only wished to prepare a fresh pot," he said defensively. "Quite understandable. However, another detail caught my attention. When Dr. Grayson entered, there was a brief pause before his coffee was prepared." Inspector Finch turned his head toward Bellamy again. "A pause?" Bellamy shifted uncomfortably. "Only a moment. I was busy with other customers." The inspector said nothing, but his expression had grown more thoughtful. Miss Marple continued calmly. "Dr. Grayson was known to visit every morning at the same time. His order never changed." "That is correct," Bellamy admitted. Inspector Finch leaned slightly closer to the table and examined the cup again. "Doctor," addressing the physician who had arrived earlier, "if the cause of death was sudden poisoning, would the symptoms appear so quickly?" The doctor nodded slowly. "Yes, certain substances could produce exactly this effect." A quiet tension settled over the room once more. Thomas Reed looked suddenly frightened. "Poison?" he whispered. Inspector Finch straightened and looked around the café carefully. "If poison was involved," he said calmly, "then the question becomes very simple. Who placed it in the coffee?" No one answered. The silence stretched long enough to make several people uncomfortable. Miss Marple turned her attention toward the counter again. A small shelf held several glass jars filled with coffee beans. Next to them sat a row of metal tins used for grinding and measuring. Something about their arrangement seemed slightly unusual. She stepped closer and studied them quietly. "Mr. Bellamy," asked Miss Marple gently, "do you grind the beans yourself each morning?" Bellamy nodded. "Yes, it keeps the flavor fresh." Miss Marple examined one of the tins carefully before speaking again. "And are all the beans stored here?" "Yes." She looked thoughtful. "That is curious." Inspector Finch raised an eyebrow. "Curious in what way?" Miss Marple pointed softly toward the shelf. "There are 3 jars here, but only 2 appear to have been opened today." Bellamy looked confused. "That cannot be correct." But when he stepped forward to check, his expression changed slightly. Miss Marple continued in her calm voice. "If the beans were roasted yesterday evening, it would be logical for only 1 jar to be used this morning." Inspector Finch folded his arms. "Meaning?" Miss Marple glanced once more at the coffee cup on the table. "Meaning," she said slowly, "that the coffee served to Dr. Grayson may not have come from the same beans as the coffee served to the other customers." Thomas Reed stared at her. You mean there were 2 different batches? It seems possible, Miss Marple replied gently. Arthur Bellamy's face had grown noticeably paler. That is absurd, he said quickly. Why would anyone do such a thing? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the professor's table and looked once more at the untouched coffee. The steam had finally faded, but the bitter scent remained. She leaned slightly closer, examining the cup with careful attention. Then she straightened again and spoke quietly. "I believe," she said quietly, "that Dr. Grayson's coffee was prepared very differently from the others." Inspector Finch's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you suggesting the professor was deliberately poisoned?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, Inspector. I believe someone intended for that particular cup to reach only one person." The room fell silent again. Every person present understood the meaning of her words. Dr. Leonard Grayson had not simply been unlucky. Someone in the Copper Kettle had prepared a fatal cup of coffee specifically for him. Inspector Finch looked slowly around the café once more. "This," he said firmly, "is no longer a tragic accident." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly in front of her. "No," she agreed quietly, "it is a carefully prepared crime." And somewhere within the peaceful walls of the small Bloomsbury café, the truth behind the bitter brew was waiting to be discovered.
Chapter 3. The Truth in the Bitter Brew. The tension inside the Copper Kettle had settled into a deep, uncomfortable silence. The earlier shock had begun to fade, but in its place came something heavier, a growing awareness that someone in the room might be responsible for the death of Dr. Leonard Grayson. Outside, Bloomsbury continued its ordinary routine. Carriages passed along the street, and distant voices carried through the open window. Yet inside the café, the air felt still and watchful. Inspector Harold Finch stood near the counter with his arms folded, studying every face in the room. Experience had taught him that people revealed a great deal through the smallest reactions. A shift of the eyes, a sudden movement, a careless word spoken at the wrong moment. The truth rarely stayed hidden for long when patience was applied. Miss Marple remained calm beside the professor's table. Her expression held the quiet focus of someone assembling a puzzle piece by piece. She had listened carefully to every word spoken since the inspector arrived, and now the details were arranging themselves neatly in her mind. Arthur Bellamy tried to keep busy behind a counter, though his movements lacked their usual confidence. He polished cups that were already spotless and rearranged the jars of beans several times. Each time his hands paused, his eyes drifted toward the chair where Dr. Grayson sat motionless. Thomas Reed stood near the doorway, pale and uncertain. The young assistant looked as though he wished very much to be somewhere else. Every sound made him flinch slightly, and the fear in his expression was impossible to ignore. Inspector Finch turned slowly toward the room. "Let us begin with something simple," he said. "Dr. Grayson was a regular customer. Did he have any disagreements with anyone here?" One of the men who had earlier complained about the bitter coffee cleared his throat. "Well, Inspector, the professor was not always the most agreeable fellow. He enjoyed arguments." Inspector Finch nodded. "Arguments about what?" "Oh, many things. Politics, books, university matters, but nothing that would lead to murder, surely." Miss Marple spoke quietly from across the room. "Sometimes," she said gently, "small disagreements reveal much larger troubles." Inspector Finch glanced toward her with interest. "Do you believe that happened here, Miss Marple?" She stepped closer to the counter, her eyes moving briefly toward Arthur Bellamy. "I believe Dr. Grayson was not as welcome here as he believed." Bellamy looked up sharply. "That is not true," he said quickly. "The professor was a customer like anyone else." Miss Marple studied him kindly. "Yes, Mr. Bellamy, but customers sometimes bring difficulties with them." Inspector Finch leaned slightly forward. What kind of difficulties? Miss Marple spoke with calm certainty. Financial ones. Bellamy's expression stiffened. I do not see what my finances have to do with this. Miss Marple rested her hands lightly on the counter. Quite a great deal, I suspect. The inspector watched the exchange carefully. Explain, if you would. Miss Marple nodded gently. I noticed something earlier this morning. When Dr. Grayson entered the café, Mr. Bellamy hesitated before preparing his coffee. The pause was brief, but it suggested recognition, not surprise. Bellamy's voice tightened. I serve many customers every day. Of course, Miss Marple replied softly, but Dr. Grayson was not simply another customer. He was also a man involved in the purchase of several properties in Bloomsbury. Inspector Finch's eyebrows lifted slightly. Properties? Yes, Miss Marple said, including this very building. The room grew very quiet. Arthur Bellamy's shoulders sagged slightly, as though the strength had left them. Inspector Finch spoke carefully. Are you saying Dr. Grayson owned this property? Bellamy answered before Miss Marple could speak. He was planning to buy it, he muttered. Miss Marple nodded. And once he did, Mr. Bellamy's café would likely have been forced to close. Thomas Reed looked shocked. You mean the café was going to be taken away? Bellamy rubbed his forehead tiredly. Yes, he said quietly, the professor wanted to convert the entire building into offices for the university. Inspector Finch looked thoughtful. That certainly provides a motive. Miss Marple continued gently, but motive alone does not explain the method. She walked toward the shelf of coffee jars once more and examined them carefully. As I mentioned earlier, 2 jars had been opened this morning. That suggested 2 separate batches of coffee beans. Inspector Finch nodded slowly, and one of them contained poison. Yes. Thomas Reed looked horrified. But I prepared the coffee exactly as Mr. Bellamy instructed. Miss Marple turned toward him with a reassuring smile. And I believe you, Thomas. Bellamy looked up suddenly. What are you implying? Miss Marple's voice remained calm. I am implying that the poison was not placed in the beans by accident. It was added intentionally to a very specific portion. Inspector Finch looked at Bellamy again. Did you prepare a separate batch for Dr. Grayson? Bellamy's silence answered the question before he spoke. I only meant to scare him, he weakly said. Thomas Reed stared in disbelief. Scare him? Bellamy's voice trembled. He came here last week and told me I had 30 days to leave. 20 years of my life spent building this place, and he planned to take it without a second thought. Miss Marple listened quietly. Bellamy continued, his voice growing strained. I thought if he became ill after drinking the coffee, he might stay away. I never intended to kill him. Inspector Finch's expression remained serious. What substance did you add? Bellamy lowered his head. A small bottle of powder. I bought it from a chemical supplier. They said it would make someone violently sick. The doctor, standing nearby, spoke slowly. Unfortunately, the substance you used was far more dangerous than you realized. Bellamy's hands trembled. I did not know, he whispered. Miss Marple looked at him with gentle sadness. Poison rarely behaves the way people expect. Inspector Finch stepped forward. Mr. Bellamy, I must place you under arrest for the murder of Dr. Leonard Grayson. Bellamy did not resist. The room remained silent as the inspector led him toward the door. Thomas Reed leaned heavily against the counter, still trying to process everything that had happened. Miss Marple picked up the abandoned coffee cup and studied it one last time before placing it back on the table. Inspector Finch paused near the doorway. You noticed the truth very quickly, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. In small communities, people often reveal their troubles long before the crime itself appears. The inspector nodded with respect. Well, thanks to your observation, this bitter mystery has been resolved.
Miss Marple returned to her seat near the window. Outside, the streets of Bloomsbury continued their quiet morning routine, yet inside the Copper Kettle, the familiar comfort of coffee and conversation would never feel quite the same again. Miss Marple lifted her teacup and took a thoughtful sip. "The smallest details," she murmured softly, "often reveal the most important truths." And so the mystery of the bitter brew had come to an end. But as Miss Marple often knew, another mystery was always waiting somewhere nearby. If you enjoy quiet mysteries, clever clues, and stories where the truth hides in plain sight, be sure to subscribe to the channel and return for the next Miss Marple investigation. Another puzzling case may begin sooner than anyone expects.